This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here, we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. Well, we're really excited to get to speak with Professor Raphael Folsom, who is a scholar of colonial Latin America and who focuses on native peoples and imperial borderlands in New Spain. His first book, The Yaquis and the Empire, Violence, Spanish Imperial Power, and Native Resilience in Colonial Mexico, was published by Yale University Press. And he's also the author of How to Get Grant Money in the Humanities and Social Sciences, which was also published by Yale. And it's really the reason that we wanted to talk with him today. It's a great book, and our Humanities Center here at UF was able to bring Rafe to campus for some workshops with faculty and graduate students. So this actually feels like a whole other part of your academic career in a way. I wonder if you've been doing a lot of talking about it.
Yes, I have recently, and there was a kind of a lull during COVID, and I've did more before and sort of picking up since. But it started with my work with graduate students at OU. University of Oklahoma is a big public research university, and there's real demand for research money. I think a lot of graduate students would really sort of struggle to get their research funded. And the whole kind of art and craft and science of getting research money is not something that's really systematically taught most places. And I started leading graduate students through that process. And that eventuated in writing this book about it. And since the book has come out, every once in a while, I got an invitation from people like you who want to bring me in to help people increase the likelihood of their projects being funded. And I get a lot of pleasure out of helping people do just that.
There's a little story you tell early in the book about how even Curtis Sittenfeld, this novelist whom I love, so I loved reading this, got tons of rejections before Prep, her big book, was published, and that was her first book. Do you find those kinds of stories helpful, or, how have they inspired you?
I didn't really understand before graduate school, or maybe even afterward, how valuable failure is. I used to think of failure as kind of a bad thing, and now what I tell graduate students and try to tell myself is that the way that you can kind of measure your progress in academic life is the number of rejection letters you get. And the process of failing is so deeply useful and I think salutary for any intellectual or creative endeavor. Having people who you respect and who respect you and want you to succeed, carefully read through your materials, meticulously identify what works and what doesn't work. Measuring your work against the strongest people in your field. It's tough. There's no doubt about it. It's demanding. It's taxing. It can be hard on the ego, but it's incredibly salutary for any thinker, any creative person. And if you're able to kind of force yourself or persuade yourself to accept the criticisms and objections you get in good grace or with good grace, and try and use them as tools to kind of improve and deepen and refine your own thinking. It's just an incredibly creative process, and it's a little bit like running a marathon or swimming across the English Channel or something. It is really tough while you're doing it, but it makes you stronger and better and a stronger thinker and a more creative person, I think. So I always try and think of failures like rejected grant applications as kind of tools for personal growth. And I don't always. I get angry.
Yeah.
I like to curse out my reader number 2 who says mean things about my awesome ideas. But once again, I always try and kind of step back and persuade myself. You know what? Reader 2 may have been an annoying person, but their comments are useful. And in fact, I hate to say it, but they may be right about a few things. I'm going to have to adjust. So yeah, I would say failure / rejection, It's a very good thing, and keep on telling yourself that, and you may start believing
Right.
it.
That would be nice. Something you mentioned in your book and also came up in our conversation before is that it sounds like you were the child of academics. I'm
Yes.
curious if you grew up sort of knowing how important applying for money or going through this process that takes so much time with applications for grants. Did you absorb any of that as a kid?
Interestingly, I didn't. My parents met in graduate school in literature and English at Berkeley in the 1960s, and they went on to careers that were not really research focused. My mother taught for 47 years at Wheelock College in Boston, which is a small, primarily women's college that focuses largely on training people to become professionals in early childhood education. And she was responsible for the kind of the humanities side of their education. So at her knee, I learned to appreciate, Shakespeare and Jane Austen and the kind of the great authors of the Anglo-American canon that she taught regularly, and also Western Civ and things like that. But her career was really a teaching-focused one, and she's got a few wonderful books that she edited on teaching Jane Austen. If you ever want to know how to teach, Mansfield Park or Pride and Prejudice, look up Marcia Folsom. Those are incredible resources, and there's great scholarship in them. But it's not like research-heavy work. And my dad had a career that he started off teaching English, interestingly, at MIT, but then sort of went off the tenure track and ended up founding a museum in Boston called the Charles River Museum of Industry that's still there. And it's focused on the really interesting history of labor and technology in Massachusetts in the 19th century. And he died in 1991 before I ever got into academia. And I learned later that he got money for his museum by through I think the NEH or NSF or something. But the grant writing process is not something that I really learned from them. I think being able to talk with academics and be around academics and absorbing some of the things that they're interested in, that was part of my growing up, and it was hugely valuable in a whole variety of different ways. But in terms of the craft of grant writing, which is something quite specific, that was never part of our conversations. So it's odd. Yes, being a child of academics made a huge difference in my career. Not in that area, though.
Yeah, in terms of learning how to write for grants, there's a story you tell about, I guess, when you were in grad school, you had this idea for this conference, or at least bringing together, folks at Yale where you were to talk about NAFTA, a
Mhm.
big deal at the time. And it was sort of a small idea, and it sounds like some of the professors thought it's kind of boring sounding. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a wild experience, and it was funny because I think I mentioned this in the book. Like every time the project sort of moved forward a step, it was surprising, and all of the surprises were pleasant surprises. And it ended up being something completely different from anything I could have expected. So, I had been very interested in the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was something that's still even in the news today. It facilitates, but with complexities, commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it was something that I thought really connected deeply, everyday American realities with, the deep history of Mexico and the United States and migration between the two. And at the time, what was being discussed was the free trade area of the Americas, which would theoretically sort of extend NAFTA to all of the Americas. And that never happened, but it was very much in the news at that time. So I said, hey, do you think there would be money for a conference on this? Kind of pointing, looking at social sciences, economics, history, bringing together all these different people from across campus to talk about this topic of shared interest. And my advisor said, yes, that would be interesting. Go and talk to the head of the Center for International and Area Studies, who's an economist named Gustav Ranis. And Ranis was skeptical. Sounds kind of interesting. It's important, but it sounds tedious. A couple people from across campus. Nobody's going to be interested in that. You're going to want to go much bigger than what you're talking about here. Like, how about if we, bring in some people from outside of campus? And I was like, oh, okay, that would require more money. And he's like, yeah. if you do the legwork, I think we can come up with 10,000. And I was like, what? I've never heard of that amount of money before in an academic context. And I went to various other kind of, institutes across the university and said, hey, I've got $10,000 from this group. Do you think you can put some money in? And then everybody wanted to be a part of it. And that sort of snowballed. And we ended up with a budget of like $35,000. And the keynote speaker was the president of Mexico, or former president, Ernesto Zedillo, who had recently become a part of Yale as a center of a new institute there. And it was quite fascinating. I mean, both, the content was really interesting because economists and historians of Mexico don't really talk to each other. And the historians all thought trade was this sort of thin veil for, United States imperialism, whereas the economists thought, this is incredible. This is going to raise standards of living and, deepen commercial ties and sort of lock in, various sort of structural reforms that we've been pushing for a long time. This is going to be great. And it was fascinating to see the sort of the dialogue across ideological lines. And some of the people who were involved were quite high-level Mexican officials who were involved in the negotiation of these treaties. And it was just fascinating to see the way that they interacted with historians, the way that historians kind of revised their views in light of sort of disciplinary perspectives that they hadn't been aware of, in light of, inside information that they had never had access to. It was kind of an extraordinary experience. And I give a lot of credit to my advisor, Gil Joseph, who sort of paved the road and kind of made connections for me that were very helpful. I was kind of more credible because Gil was behind me. But that experience of ambition and bigness being a good thing, and it being actually easier to finance bigger, more ambitious projects than small bore, niche projects, that was a powerful lesson to me. And ambition is a tool, a very powerful tool, and it can be, used to open doors in ways that I wasn't aware of until then.
I think it's difficult, especially for us humanities folks, to know how and when to think big. It reminds me, even with my dissertation, where I in part focused on this genre of books I called Introduction to Judaism books. That was just one part of the dissertation. One of my dissertation committee members thought, oh, the book you publish from this dissertation should be about that genre because it's something new that you sort of discover, or is a contribution you have. When I was talking to an editor who was interested in publishing a book sort of based on or inspired by the dissertation, I said, oh, well, that's one option of what I could offer here. And she sort of said, that sounds small and boring. And if you think that's important, go and do that elsewhere. But it did remind me, it feels like there is this divide that we humanities scholars often have between what might be valued within academia. And then sometimes I feel like when we're applying for grants, for instance, we're dealing with a wider audience that wants to feel something bigger, that they're contributing to something bigger.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. And I think this is one of the major kind of, barriers to entry to actually getting, significant funding for your research. You have to be ambitious, but not too ambitious, or ambitious in the right way and in the right context. And I think the problem of being too small, too niche, too narrow, that's a great way to get rejected for a lot of things. Being too grandiose and too sweeping and huge, that's also a great way of being rejected for a lot of things. What you want to do is have this kind of carefully controlled, carefully sort of calibrated and modulated ambition where you're saying, you know exactly the amount of research you're going to do. In history, it's always going to be, micro-historical because you can't, physically read enough, primary material to, write the history of a nation over many decades. So it's got to be micro-historical, but based on a lot of hard-slogging research. And I would imagine there's analogous things you could say about other fields, just with different, documents or sources. But it's got to be carefully delimited. And then once you've sort of delimited the actual, physical work of doing the research, it has to transcend its own narrowness and shed light on other things. So, there's one book that I always say, if you weren't going to read one book as a kind of a professional historian or really motivated history buff, you want to learn about colonial Latin America, you should read this book called Drinking, Homicide, and Rebellion in Colonial Mexican Villages by William Taylor. And what Taylor did is he went and read like hundreds of criminal cases from the Mexican archives, national archives, dealing with those three issues: drinking, homicide, rebellion. And It's a ton of work that he was able to do, but it's something one could complete in a period of months or small number of years. But what's fascinating about it is that by looking deeply into things as, how does the town deal with a town drunk? Or, what happens when a crowd of women comes out and starts throwing rocks at the Spanish official who comes to, collect taxes? It reflects on these incredibly deep patterns of Mexican social organization and village life. And that I think is kind of paradigmatic for me. And I think for a lot of research projects, it's like deeply researched with careful limits around the edges of the research so it doesn't go on forever. But that is reflective of kind of social and political and cultural patterns that are found in a lot of different places. And to do all those things at once is incredibly hard. I mean, there are very few books that are as good as, Drinking, Homicide, and Rebellion. But that's sort of the model that I think scholars in the humanities and social sciences should have in the back of their head of what am I trying to propose? A deep dive into a narrowly defined topic, carefully delimited, that reflects in interesting ways on contiguous and other related topics.
Yeah. Another aspect of the book and of grant writing that you address is, I think you've got a chapter called Assembling a Team or something like that. This felt like, to me, one of the hardest parts of grant writing. I hate asking for people for things. So if something does not require recommendation letters, there's like a much greater chance that I'm going to do it. But, one of the things you do talk about really well in there is kind of taking care of these relationships, which I feel like is not something we explain to students or academics well. And I do wonder about it, how we stay in touch in a way that isn't just I'm sending you my latest journal articles, which feels kind of braggy. And sometimes having been on the other end of that, it doesn't always feel great. But so that we don't do what you say, what I think you rightly say does not feel great either, which is just always being in touch when you just want to ask someone for something. So I wonder what you found from either end, what have felt like good ways folks have taken care of these really important relationships.
Yeah, it's such a complicated question because there's always this interesting imbalance of power and knowledge between the recommender and the recommendee. And you need to kind of develop a really good relationship with these people. And it feels like a friendship and very often kind of develops into friendship, but in important ways, it's a professional relationship as well. And it's really difficult to do. I think that there's a million ways of doing it wrong and probably fewer ways of doing it right. But I think just sort of maintaining open lines of conversation with people whose opinions you respect is the way I describe the best way of going about it. And it's different from, undergraduate to graduate school to, your academic career. But just staying in touch with people whose opinions you respect, maintaining kind of relationships of personal and intellectual exchange with people who are at different levels of the academy from yourself, both, above and below, and peer relationships. I think that's really the best way to think about it from my perspective. And, when you start out, you're always asking people who are above you, and it's kind of their job to recommend you. If they're doing their job well as a professor, somebody really puts in hard work and does a great job in your class, I feel kind of honored when somebody says, "Hey, would you write a letter for me?" It means they respect my view. They took satisfaction in learning from the experience of studying with me. I, really get a thrill out of kind of launching people on their careers in good ways. It does change later. I mean, one of the things that I discovered, I didn't know this after, shortly after I got out of graduate school, but at that stage in one's career, one's dissertation advisors become less and less credible witnesses about the quality of your work because they're eager for you to finish. They want to kind of send you on their way so they can focus on people who are coming after you. And they're also sort of perceived as your parents, like they've got a vested interest in your success. Of course, they like you and think you're brilliant, and want you to kind of go on to succeed. And therefore, their word doesn't really hold as much weight as it might otherwise. And what you need to do is kind of develop relationships with people, I think peers and kind of senior peers after you finish graduate school and are a kind of a working scholar, because those are the witnesses who are kind of seen as more credible. They're the people who are going to be able to say, hey, this person's been doing a great job. They deserve a fellowship from the ACLS or some comparable institution. And developing that kind of group of professional mentors, some within your own institution and some outside of it, is a hugely important feature of academic careers that I didn't really know about, and I had to find out about from in a variety of different ways. But here I am telling you now.
Yeah.
Beginning scholars, do that. It's really important.
Yeah.
You need people who can testify to the quality of your work, who are credible.
One of the great features of your book is that you have these interviews at the end of it with some really, kind of prestigious, well-known, high, I guess what we would say, senior scholar types. And one of them, maybe it was Michelle Lamont, might have talked about how actually you can really see the difference in recommendation letters. And I thought this was a nice inspiration for those of us who are now in the position to write recommendation letters, that she said, or someone said something like, the Yale folks really write great letters. And so it was a reminder that if I'm writing for someone, someone respected scholars out wherever on a grant or a other grad school are thinking, Rachel Gordon is a great writer. She really notices the details. She's that kind of supportive professor and good writer. So it's also about the letter writers sort of sending out messages about themselves in the academic world.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And you've probably been involved in the selection process in an academic job search where you've got hundreds of applications and you're reading tons of letters in that context. And it's true. I think that the quality of letters really does vary enormously. And sometimes it's clearly the fault of the person who's being recommended that the letter isn't strong. They were too late. They haven't been in touch with the person that they're asking the letter for, asking for the letter from. Sometimes it's the fault of the recommender. I think that oftentimes people who recommend a lot of people and say they're all geniuses, that comes from a good place. They really want these people to succeed. But if everybody's a genius, then nobody's a genius. And I think it's a very difficult kind of skill for senior scholars to acquire, to be able to recommend a variety of different people in ways that are honest, but still supportive, and to kind of preserve their own credibility, because that's really valuable. I think that there are circumstances in which people have erroneously recommended somebody, and it turned out to be a disaster, either for the person who they recommend, or for the hiring institution that picks that person up. And that's certainly an unusual outcome, but it can happen. And I think that there are definite people that I can think of off the top of my head who take enormous pride in both being detailed and thorough and narrative and engaging in the way that they write, while at the same time preserving their credibility without undermining any of the people that they're recommending. I mean, it's a hugely complex set of calculations that one has to make, and inevitably some people do it better than others. And sometimes individuals, like, they'll do a better job on one candidate than they will on a different day, simply because they didn't have the time or what have you. But that's another thing. I mean, it's sort of above my level in the academy. But at some point, I wonder if there are people out there mentoring senior scholars on how to do that. And I know that senior scholars struggle with it. And I've talked with a few of them, trying to figure out, all right, I've got these 5 graduate students. They're all in the job market. How do I manage this? How do I get the most success for the most students, or help them obtain the most success possible? It's not easy.
Yeah. I know in my own field that we do sometimes hear about who is a really great letter writer. And so I sort of like the idea of that contributing to the idea of someone being a great professor, that they took the time on this thing that is often somewhat thankless and kind of unknown to many other people.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that there's a legitimate resentment on the part of, letter writers, where there's some jobs that, I think some actually job applications have only started asking for recommendations for, a short list, just to not put this huge burden on all the recommenders. But yeah, it can be quite tiresome and quite hard. And I'm kind of astonished by some professors who manage to be incredibly productive on a scholarly level and yet produce these works of art for graduate students. It's just extraordinary.
Something else that was mentioned at the end, which I'd never thought of, was that I think, someone said it can hurt if it seems like the recommender has this kind of better grasp on the project, which I'd never thought of, but I suppose it could seem like, wait, why hasn't the person who's working on this figured this out? Or maybe they're not far along enough. What was your idea of what the solution to that kind of situation should be?
Gosh, it's funny. I hadn't noticed that until I heard. I think there were a couple of interviewees who said something along those
Mhm.
lines, and then once I, had that in mind, I started seeing it where
Mm.
you'd have. Graduate students. My editor of my first book, said something really deep, which is dissertations are profoundly paranoid documents because dissertation writers are just so, deeply anxious about, not doing something right, offending the wrong person, not pleasing their committee, trying to cover all their bases. It's stressful to be a graduate student, and that often kind of shows through in dissertations. And I think that kind of shows through in other contexts. In a kind of a cover letter for a job or a grant application, there's a tendency to kind of be in a defensive crouch and try and not offend anybody and kind of carefully hedge things and not go too far out on a limb. Whereas a professor who's recommending, A, they're way more experienced and they've got a lot of, many years of kind of professing what they profess. And B, the stakes are a little bit lower for them because it's not them getting turned down, it's a student. So they can, offer up a fluent, edgy, controversial, engaging, delightful description of something that the student themselves may feel, or the junior scholar, him or herself, may feel really too anxious to write about in that way. And I think if there is a solution, it has to be in communication between the letter writer and the applicant. They have to be able to say, "Hey, look, I read your project. I think it's wonderful. It's the way that it's presented. It's very difficult to see what you're trying to get across. Here's some ideas for punching this up and making it kind of clearer and more and edgier and more engaging." That would be my recommendation. But it's you can't communicate years of experience and to a person who's really junior and struggling with a difficult intellectual problem. So
Yeah. You also, by the way, have a great template for, the letter we write asking folks to write for us, which, right up front includes the, like, if you don't have time for this or you can't, I completely understand. I find that type of thing really important. But I wonder if you've noticed people getting better at this. When you're asked for letters, do you feel like people are being more respectful, or how is that working for you?
yeah, that's really interesting. I think that if anything, graduate students in particular err toward the elaborately deferential and say like, "Oh, I'm so abjectly grateful for your wonderful support, oh, professor." And sometimes it's a bit much. You can understand you want to err in that direction rather than the opposite direction. I think undergraduates can be a little bit clueless and, write emails in all caps and say, "I need a recommendation tomorrow."
Mhm.
That sort of diminishes over time. But it goes back to that kind of question, the broader question of managing relationships with recommenders, which is it's really difficult for both sides. You really have to kind of think on your toes and be respectful but not sycophantic and, maintain your self-respect while showing great respect to the person that you're asking. Being independent, not being an acolyte, or sometimes some professors really do want to have their students be an acolyte, and you have to, respond appropriately there. It's interesting. This goes to the broader question. I think this is one area in which being a child of academics was relevant in that, having grown up around them, being able to have a conversation with them wasn't a big stretch. Whereas for people who don't grow up around academics, it could be, very bewildering to try and kind of engage a respected scholar in your field in a professional yet friendly way. It's just, it doesn't come naturally to people who aren't, to very few of us, frankly. So, yeah, it's a complicated dance that people have to perform.
Part of the assembling a team that you talk about in the book is, getting people to read our drafts, give feedback. This also can feel like a really big ask.
Mm,
And I'm wondering, you've probably been in positions, with some uh, maybe sort of power as a professor where you can get a group together to do this.
hmm
But is that the main format in which you've gotten feedback, or do you have all sorts of academic friends out there that you're
mm.
sending things back and forth with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably the latter and probably more informally. And it's difficult to do the former where you've got this sort of, reading group where people are getting together and kind of, systematically giving one another feedback. I've got colleagues who have been able to maintain that with, friends and colleagues over years, which I find incredibly admirable. And I think it sort of perhaps beyond my social skills. I just feel like that's not where my talents, insofar as I have any, lay. But yeah, sort of more informal relationships where we're reading one another's work, or can I read this to you out loud? Like my wife has been an incredible interlocutor for me. I mean, this book, the grant writing book, was her idea. But having at least one person that you can kind of engage with in that way is essential. But it can work to have like a group of people. And I think that, I mentioned in the book a circumstance in which I had this grant writing group where everybody read one another's work. Everybody was required to offer substantive feedback, positive and negative. Kind of mean-spirited feedback was strictly prohibited. Empty praise was also strictly prohibited, because it can be a waste of time for everyone and quite damaging if people don't have a clear idea of the virtues of their work, but rather have a kind of a broad general sense of, there are people out there that like this for reasons that I don't understand. And if it can work incredibly well. I think that it's bracing to hear criticism. It's, and it feels real because you're offering criticism to the same people. The praise feels real because you're, offering praise, to the people that are reading your work, and you're trying to be as, you're doing as much as you can to substantially increase the possibility of that person getting money. That can be very useful, but it is difficult. It requires a kind of a effort of mind. It may require some money, or may require some good, senior faculty to help kind of step in and assist. I've tried to do it on other occasions, and it didn't really come together as well as it should. And sometimes it's been my fault. I've been invited to be part of things, and I just couldn't commit to it. So you have to kind of improvise and find that kind of feedback wherever it is. One thing I would add is I think that I think part of the reason I like doing visits where I come to a campus and help people get more money for their work is that I really enjoy it. I get a kind of a thrill out of seeing people succeed with my help, and I think that it's something that I would encourage others to engage in. I mean, if you want, good feedback for your own work, offer a lot of feedback to other people's work. So there's just a ever enlarging, cohort of people out there in the world who you've helped and responded to in detailed and thoughtful ways. I think that's a great way of, cultivating a community of people who are, looking to help you wherever they can.
Yeah, that idea of barring empty praise is a really good one. And I think about doing that with my undergrads too, because sometimes we do kind of workshops, and I've been guilty of it because I have, quote, really liked reading this piece, but then I haven't thought hard enough about why.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, it would be so much helpful to make it, that we have to be specific.
Mm.
As you were saying about being someone who's also giving a lot of good feedback, this is something you discuss in the book about being a giver. This, I guess, Adam Grant idea, which seems great. I guess I have maybe some jaded reply of like, don't we all encounter so many academics who are not that way, which makes it all the harder? So like, how this great attitude that you describe, how do we maintain that?
Yeah, it's really hard. I think that you're right, because so Adam Grant is this interesting professor of management at University of Pennsylvania, and he's published a number of books. And that idea of, I guess, givers, matchers, and takers. And he says, like, in every organization, there are givers, matchers, and takers. And all of those strategies can work as kind of career strategies. Matchers are people who say, you do something good for me, I do something good for you. Good. I've matched your effort in my favor for something equal. And if you try and hurt me, I'm going to do the same thing to you. Takers, they're definitely out there, and they're people who are exclusively out for themselves and tend to either step on or ignore or subtly undermine people that are around them. And it's interesting because it can be a successful career strategy because people actually rise to great heights by acting that way in some cases. And what Grant's thesis is that that's actually kind of unusual. And in fact, the success of people who are habitually exploitative toward others is kind of fragile because there's so many people out there who are, predisposed to not want to help that person, not want to support them, be happy when they, run into trouble. And his thesis, and he backs this up with more numbers than I can muster, is that people who are habitually givers, who really want to see the people around them succeed, who go out of their way to help. I mean, he says specifically this is not selflessness. Selflessness means a degree of self-sacrifice that is not healthy for the person doing it, and in the end, probably not helpful for others or the organization that person's working within, because it just depletes the energy that they have. It's being a giver, as I understand it, is sort of drawing energy from and thriving on seeing the people around you succeed. And I coach my kids' little soccer team, and I'm like, look, the kid that I want on my team is the kid who makes other players better, and that kid is going to be very successful on this team and on other teams. And I think that's kind of true academically as well. If you're the person who's out there who really passes the ball and supports your teammates and reads other people's stuff and offers good feedback, over time, you're going to have a community of people that feels, very well disposed to helping your career out. And we are in such a collaborative and such a social profession that it's impossible to succeed without that. So I think that, Grant's thesis is certainly held to be true in my case. I also have I've had the incredible good fortune of studying with very generous mentors like, Gil Joseph. Stuart Schwartz was the co-advisor of my dissertation, an extraordinary scholar, extraordinary mentor and giver himself. Tom Conley is an undergraduate, and a whole series of other people who have kind of modeled that way of being professionals, and their ascent to the absolute pinnacle of academic success, to my mind, is a really, a strong piece of evidence in favor of Grant's argument.
Yeah, and it does make working more pleasant and positive if we all, try to cultivate that. There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one is, what is something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career?
Gosh, that's a great question. I guess there are two things. And I was just telling this to a colleague of yours this afternoon, and it sort of came to me and hasn't left my mind since it popped into my head a few hours ago. One thing, publishers are really important, and having a good publisher really matters. What's more important than that is probably having a good editor. And I think it's very important to kind of do due diligence on the people that are going to be editing your books and articles, which I didn't do. It was sort of on intuition that I ended up with an extraordinarily good, efficient, generous, wonderful, sainted editor named Laura DeVoulis at Yale Press. And, I owe a huge amount to her kind of shepherding my book to publication and to the awards that it won. So that's one thing I didn't know and that I would strongly recommend. Talk to colleagues about editors that they've worked with, both good and bad. Because some editors, usually a bad editor is somebody who just doesn't respond. They're just too busy. They want you to do your work and leave them alone, and that's understandable because they're so in such heavy demand. Particularly at the beginning of your career, working with somebody like that can be absolutely nerve-wracking. So, investigate your editors. Another piece of advice that I would offer is a little bit kind of more disheartening and less like a magic bullet. And I didn't realize that there's no secret to good writing. There's nothing that can get you around the fact that it is incredibly hard, long, slogging work. And those moments when it is most painful and most frustrating are often the moments in which you're making most progress. And just kind of embracing that kind of bleak fact about the writing process is really valuable. And there's comfort in it because there's community in it, because writers have all experienced that. But I think I was really slowed down, in fact, by the fact that I was waiting for a kind of a breakthrough or a big moment of fluency, or, where the sun peeked through the clouds and it seemed all clear to me. And that didn't really happen. And I think I would have kind of proceeded more quickly and more efficiently if I wasn't waiting for it. Just being sort of embracing the daily grind, embracing the fact that it's never going to be easy. But then there are moments, I think, afterward where you look back on something that was just agony to write and you think, whoa, that's really good. I didn't see that coming when I was doing it. So just sort of embracing and learning to respect and even love that experience of, I don't know what the word would be, of just struggle. Yeah, that would be something I wish I'd, grasped a little bit better earlier on in life.
It reminds me of something that came up in your book about getting grant money, which was, I forget if it was you or one of the people you interviewed at the end, noting, and this came up in our conversation today too, that it's often the case that we're best able to write a grant application when we're kind of near the end of it. And so sometimes the grant actually, or the fellowship, ends up being really for the next project. And I know when we were in this session with you earlier today here at UF, we were all talking about that, and part of me just felt like maybe we should just sometimes embrace that the
Mm,
fellowship might just be mostly you're getting to work on the next thing, because for some of us, it is sort of the case. It's hard to write this fluently about it
mm.
until I'm kind of near the end. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's really true, and it's this odd disconnect between the kind of evaluator and the author. So if you're an evaluator, you're getting through kind of hundreds of grant applications, and you're kind of thinking, I'm putting serious money on the table to fund research that's going to result in a product, and if something appears like it's inchoate or at the early stages, or it's uncertain whether or not it's going to make it to the finish line, that doesn't seem like a particularly good investment to me. I want something where I'm going to be able to hold up this book or this article and say, my money paid for this. And it's inevitably projects that are a bit further along about which it's easier to say that. And I think there's a kind of a structural disadvantage that you're at when you're at the beginning of the project, or particularly at the beginning of your career, at the beginning of a project. That's tough to get around, but it can be gotten around. And it requires a lot of legwork, a lot of thinking, and perhaps strategic, ever so slight, not dishonest overstatement of your certainty about what
Mhm.
the conclusions that you're gonna arrive at, that enables that. But it can be done. I think and I've seen it done time and again. And once you get past that initial stage of funding your first big project, then it starts to get easier because you realize, in order to get this, I really had to do a lot of legwork. So maybe I'm on this fellowship now working on this one project. But if I see, really interesting materials for my next project, maybe I'm going to collect that and file it away such that, when I do start trying to get funding for my next project, I'll say, I know for a fact that there's this incredible material out there that I can, hit the ground running, studying when I get this grant. But yeah, it's that sort of moment of startup that's tough, and I think
Mhm.
it's incumbent on us as mentors and advisors to, help younger scholars through that.
The other question that we ask guests is if there's a writing practice or habit that works for you.
That's a great question, and this is coming from somebody who, after COVID and being director of graduate studies and having small children, is searching for writing practices that are going to help me move forward in life. The odd thing that jumps to mind is I find my best thoughts about writing and about what I'm reading come to my mind when I'm either walking or biking.
Hmm.
And I feel like the my book on grant writing, I felt like I actually wrote most of it while I was on my bike, because
Oh, wow.
I'd be riding around on my bike, and then I would get off my bike and just sort of transcribe everything that had been happening in my head beforehand. But I think that process of walking or biking or doing some sort of low intensity physical exercise and allowing your mind to do its work, and then sitting down and rapidly trying to transcribe as many of the things that you've had in your head as possible, that I've found to be very valuable, because very often, I mean, both parts of it are important. The walking and pondering are important, but then the rapid transcription is important because those thoughts, they can disappear with incredible rapidity. They're very evanescent, and they're like little butterflies you have to catch with your net before they flit away to the next backyard. But that's what I would suggest. Kind of, I don't know. I'm reminded of this great and extremely strange book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau called "The Reveries of the Solitary Walker," the Rêveries du Promeneur Solitaire, in which he kind of talks about his philosophical revelations that come to him as a solitary walker. Low intensity physical exercise followed by rapid note taking on what's going on in your head. That's a practice that I really like.
Yeah, that sounds good. And it sounds like then you are at least sometimes careful not to say, just be listening to a podcast or listening
Mm.
to whatever, but to just let your mind tune in on one of your projects.
Yes, yeah, and one funny thing is I've actually most of my non-academic reading is sort of migrated onto the audiobook form. So I listen to a
Mm.
ton of audiobooks, but I often find myself turning off the audiobook and then turning on the recorder and saying something into the recorder that occurred to me while I was doing it. So I think that's sort of a good way of combining the two practices. But yeah, I think I tell this to students, like, as they're reading books, don't just write down your quotation from the book or kind of your notes on or paraphrase of what's in the book. Pay attention to what's going on in your own head as well. Listen to the thoughts that come to you as you're reading, even if they seem unrelated to what's in front of you. They may turn out to be deeply related in ways that you aren't conscious of when they occur to you. And just the habit of listening to your own mind as it works, I think, is one way of expressing what I'm talking about.
That's great. Thank you, Rafe. This has been a lot of fun.
Likewise. So interesting. So fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.